This is the first lobe fin fish. This is where we start with Sarcopterygia. Okay. And then there's the fish side of things over here with lungfish. And how should I draw this? Coelacanth. We have to say coelacanths plural now because there's two. And I can't spell on the board. In that movie I showed you, Humanoids from the Deep, they consistently mispronounced the word through the whole movie. They call them coelacanths. And that's how I have to say it to remember how to spell it. Coelacanth.
Was that purposeful?
Probably for me, yeah. No, I think they just didn't know any better. So that's the fish side of things. Coming on this lobe fin fish thing, we're going towards tetrapods now. And this branch, let's not draw it that way. This branch, we have a bunch of lobe fin fishes. These are things in the fossil record. I'm going to draw them a little bit lower because they're in the fossil record. And there's a bunch of things in here. And we don't understand their relationships yet. And I'm going to call these aquatic tetrapods. These things are very fish-like, gill-breathing, but mostly gill, but they have lungs. But they've got those lobe fins, and so these are the guys that are up on land in emergencies. And there's a big diversity of them. We'll look at some pictures today as we define amphibians, and teasing out their relationships and the classification is very confusing. We're not going to worry about it. And these things are all extinct. There are no living things at this level. And then, at some point, we'll go even more terrestrial. And the synapomorphy here that your book gives, it's an overly simplistic one, but we'll use it. Limbs, those lobe fins become limbs, and more than just limbs, they're limbs with digits. Not fin rays at the end, but fingers or toes. And that is kind of the point where we say, okay, we've got something that's significant, that's got significant terrestrial presence, and we're going to call that a true tetrapod. Not one of these aquatic ones, but a true one. And so these things diversified. This is Devonian. They're all over the place. The world's covered with rainforests, Devonian and Carboniferous. And these things make, again, big diversity, but only two things come out of this that survive into modern times. This is where we are now. We've got one group that goes more terrestrial, and words that we're going to run into, I'm not going to use them a whole lot, but at the bottom end of this are things called lepo, I got to get the spelling right, spondles. A complex group of things that are only in the fossil record, and the way we classify them now. And then these transition into the amniota. And this is, again, reptiles and mammals. These are the terrestrial ones. And so this branch went terrestrial. We'll talk about that starting Monday. The other branch here, again, you get there's all sorts of diversity down here. All sorts of extinct stuff. Another branch, which doesn't amount to much, it's not a nice way to put that, but doesn't amount to much, are the temnospondles. And spondle refers to vertebrae. The vertebrae are very different. We don't need to worry about that. But there's a nice diversity of these guys. They go all over the place. And they diversify in this very rainforesty world. And these guys never go very terrestrial. And they give rise to the modern amphibians. And that's where we are today. So that summarizes a lot of what we did Friday. I know it gets kind of complicated when I throw these big fossil words at you in the evolutionary trees, but I think this summarizes it nicely. Remember, everybody is a lobe-fin fish. Everybody here. That's the starting point. Got lungfishes and coelacanths at the bottom end. And one branch went this route and eventually ended up going terrestrial. Okay? Clarifying or confusifying? Confusifying. It's like Sarah Palin. I can make up words.
So, are there temnospondyls left? I don't.
You know, I was looking at that. This is paleotheology and paleovertebrate. Not my thing. Near as I can tell, modern amphibians, by some people, are considered to be modern temnospondyls. So I'm not. That's why I didn't put a dagger there, but I'm not worried about that. They show up in the fossil record, and they may still be represented by modern amphibians. The lepospondals show up in the fossil record, and the current reading, as I looked at it this morning, modern amniotes are not lepospondals. A distinction is important, but not that important to us. Okay? All right. Well, what I want you to do is just put the exam out of your mind for, not tomorrow, I don't think. Well, as long as it takes to go through amphibians, and I don't think it'll be that long. Amphibians are dragging out. We'll leave some of them until Monday ahead of where I won't be anyway. So just put that out of your mind for a few minutes, and let's just look at this stuff here. Get this thing off. My daughter's friend saw my phone, which I've used once in the last 6 months. And she said, that's an old person's phone. Yes, I know your point is. Okay. So we talked about some of this last chapter, and I was noticing, so I've reworked this again. So if you go to Blackboard, there's a new version of this chapter that I put up just about half an hour ago. It's not that different, but I kind of slimmed it down. We did a bunch of this stuff Friday, the tetrapod origins. We're going to touch it again today as it applies to amphibians. The one I want to get to today is amphibians, which is one of my favorite groups. When I was a kid, I grew up in deserts and mountains, and so amphibians were something you didn't see every day. If I grew up in the South, I'd probably be very familiar with frogs and toads, but I always thought catching an amphibian, particularly a salamander, was a really cool thing. Just didn't see them. So there's our evolutionary trait for the tetrapods. Okay, I just basically put this on the board here. There's our little finfish ancestor. These are the fish versions. Dipnus. Where is he? Dip, by the way, D-I-P-N. That means lungfish. And here's those two branches. And all this cool stuff down here in the fossil record. Your batteries in this. So the story here, and we did some of this Friday, so if I was calling out some of the repetition, but there's probably still some here. The story here is we're trending from aquatic to terrestrial, and we're ending up going terrestrial in kind of two different ways. And then there's all this fossil stuff down here, the classification of which, the identification of which, the group assignments for these different things is not real clear in my mind, so we're not worried about that. So you can see here's those temnospondyls here, there's the lepospondyls there, and there's a little uncertainty in my mind how those are currently classified. Let's not worry about them. They're cool, but let's not worry about it. So there's this big divergence. And once these tetrapods get up on land, Carboniferous, there's this big divergence. And one branch stays fairly aquatic. And these are terrestrial tetrapods. These are amphibians. You can think frog. But they're not particularly good at terrestrial living. The other branch goes hyperterrestrial, and this leads to mammals and reptiles. And that's what we'll spend probably all of next week on. This is our second week, right? Yeah. So next week's third week. Yeah. So, two surviving tetrapod lineages, and let's just get those words in our vocabulary. I think amniote we know. Amniote, again, is reptiles and mammals. These are the terrestrial tetrapods. And remember, if you take a Greek word and you put an A in front of it, you make it the opposite. So the tetrapods that are not amniotes are anamniotes. So I want to start using that word. Fishes are anamniotes, but we don't usually use that word to describe fishes. It's usually amphibians and those fossil things that we would call anamniotes. In this context, we're most interested in living stuff. Herpetology is the science we're now in. Herpetology is the science of reptiles and amphibians. They're lumped together. And it's from the Greek word herping, which means to creep. And one of our labs, our field trip lab, maybe we'll want to go down. One of the things we've done in the past, we've gone down to the park where the scary dairy is, and we go herping, which means we're out looking for reptiles and amphibians, particularly reptiles. And it's pretty, depending on the time of day and how much, sadly, how much pieces of metal are still lying on the ground there. Lift things up and find herbs, usually snakes, which is always fun. If you don't like snakes, you don't have to get close to them. This is a class we don't have on this campus, but it's taught at many campuses. We herpetology. Okay, so what we're talking about here is the class Amphibia. That's where we're headed. We're not quite there yet, but that's where we want to go. And in the strict sense, that little Latin there, sensu stricto, which means in the strict sense. And that means when we use the word amphibian, when I'm using the word amphibian, I'm talking about the living ones and their very recent fossil ancestors. But we're not talking about that stuff deep in the fossil record. Some textbooks refer to all that early stuff as amphibians. I'm not going to. So I want to use the word in the strict sense. Another word for them, and I'm not going to use this probably again, but I may point out a couple times, is lysamphibian. I'm not sure where that comes from. But that means modern amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and a crowd you're not familiar with called caecilians, which we'll get to in a little while. Not all of this stuff. So there's that cool diversity of early tetrapods, early terrestrial tetrapods, and textbooks typically call those amphibians. I'm not going to. Yeah.
So if we see amphibian, it's an amphibian as we know it
It's a frog, it's a salamander, it's a caecilian. If I use the word amphibian, that's how we're using it. If I put quotes around, I might be talking about all this fossil stuff. This stuff. These things are often called amphibians because they're very amphibian-like in their biology. But they're not technically amphibians because amphibians start way over here. So, yeah, non-amnio, non-amphibian tetrapods. That's just vocabulary. And there's that little summary chart I made. This is, again, a good one to get us from tetrapods to amniotes and amphibians. If this doesn't make sense to you, you should sit down, move your finger around it, and ask some questions. But I think this is a nice transition from fish to tetrapod and from aquatic to terrestrial, and graphically lays out, again, those awkward names up there telling us what we're looking at. This stuff, there's the true amphibians. This stuff here, very amphibian-like in their biology. They're probably soft-skinned, salamander-y looking things, they're about this big, but technically not amphibians. Okay. Did that. So it's just repeating what I just said. Yep, there we go. Okay, let's review what we did Friday a little bit and apply it to this transition to amphibians. Tetrapod origins. So there's another cartoon. There's lots of cartoons on tetrapod origins. That's my brother and my sister and I. We need one more little fish there when we were kids. And when we drive places, at some point during the trip, my mother would always turn around with this big snarl on her face and she'd say, "See this? This is why we don't go to Disneyland."
Oh.
And we never did. I didn't go to Disneyland until like 3 years ago.
Oh.
Yeah. We took my daughter. So, anyway, let's remind ourselves where we were Friday, and let's think about niche. We're at a time when there are no terrestrial vertebrates. A huge diversity of vertebrates in water, none on land. And this is a freshwater transition. We're in freshwater habitats probably choked with vegetation and weeds, and that's a habitat that probably favored these lobe-finned fishes. Those lobe fins were probably about crawling around underwater, but in a habitat where swimming was maybe a little bit of a challenge. So there wasn't anything up on land, vertebrate-wise, but there were resources up there. There's oxygen up there. There's a place where there's no predators. There's food up there because there were invertebrates up there. So down there in the water, there were challenges. I just love these paintings. That's why I keep putting them in here. Up here on land, there were certainly challenges, but they were advantageous, and it's advantageous for someone to start adapting to move up there, and particularly in the context of a freshwater habitat that is very temporary, and you might regularly in your evolutionary history be exposed to being able to needing to be on land. So there you go. I just love this. There's that big carnivorous lobe-finned fish, and there's his descendant getting out of his mouth range. So anyway, 350 million years ago, we started having creatures utilize these terrestrial habitats. First as an emergency or an accident. Later, we're up there, there's resources there. We start to see natural selection pushing creatures in that direction. So lobe-finned fish. That's the ancestor, and that's Eusthenopteron. That's our classic lobe-finned fish. Probably very coelacanth-like in a lot of ways, but the coelacanth is the marine version of this kind of lobe-finned fish, and this is the freshwater version. And so the early tetrapods came out of this ancestry. And the early tetrapods, again, were aquatic creatures. Unquestioned fish, semi-terrestrial or terrestrial tetrapod, and then the stuff in between. The lynx, as they're sometimes called in the popular media. So we did this last time. I need to add a little bit more. Word I like that someone coined a while back is fishapod. Not a tetrapod, not a fish. So we're starting to see adaptations that suggest we're up on land. Reduction in the gill covers, right? Limbs becoming strengthened, fin rays disappearing and fingers showing up. And remember the other one? A neck that you can twist. So we start to see these kind of traits showing up in these intermediate things, which were, by and large, I'll say it one more time, mostly aquatic. And this is an evolutionary tree. Unquestioned fish is Eusthenopteron, and by the time we get down here to Great Teton, we're talking about something that's up on land probably a lot of the time. I guess you picture a salamander today. So it's just not one of these little posters you find online. No transitional fossils. You often hear people say there's no transitional fossils, no such thing. Pandrothites events. There he is. Come on out here, folks. It looks like we're the first ones. First ones. We've been here 60 million years, say the millipedes. And that's the problem.
I wonder what they eat.
Yeah, this was the food source. And we had a whole array of creatures up on land that were predator naive. It was probably a horrible time to be one of those creatures. And there's the same thing, though. I'll be the first on land, says the first tetrapod. Nope, here's bugs are already here. Don't worry, they won't get the credit. Why not? Because my descendants will write the book. Okay. So, just a few of the players in here. Did that, already did that. Did that. Okay. So, bottom end here, we're still fishes. Lobe-finned fishes. And one of the traits that defines all the tetrapods, including some of the lobe-finned fishes, is those internal nares. Those internal nares, that connects the nostril to the roof of the mouth. We call that group of animals, it's called a choanada, which means they have choanae. And there's that connection there, external, internal. So this is a creature that has a passage from the top of the snout into the mouth. And that was one of those things we call pre-adaptation. I don't know what the evolutionary significance was early on, what they were using that for, but it set them up to be able to fill their lungs through their nose, which we think is normal, but that for a fish was a very, very weird thing. And so these things could stick their snouts up out of the water or crawl up on land, and with their mouth closed, they could breathe. And we'll look at these. We have a frog lab. We can look at these in frogs. In you, they're hidden. If we look at a mammal skull, they're hidden. But in a frog, they're right there. You can put your finger on them. So, there we are. There's the bottom end there. And Euripidistian is a real good example of one of these things, Eusthenopteron. These guys, again, it's getting repetitive, terrestrial only in an emergency. And we trend terrestrial coming off that ancestor, and we have a series of developments here, and I'll go through a couple of these that are important, that are promoting more terrestrial success. And that gives us the ancestors of the rest of the tetrapods. And then a little bit after that, again, these guys up on land, probably not their whole life, but the next step up is even more alterations to the anatomy and the biology, and now we're predominantly terrestrial, going into water less and less. And there's those ancient experiments that we call fissiopods, these creatures in the transitional zone. Still really closely tied to water, but more and more up on land. And how do we pronounce this? Someone gave me this yesterday. Tikliak?
Tiktaalik?
Tiktaalik. Let's go with that. That makes sense. Tiktaalik. It's an Inuit word. There's our classic fishapod right there in the center, and this was discovered about 15 years ago. He's got a neck. He's got well-developed pectoral limb there. Still a fin at the end of it, but it's more of a limb. And he's losing his opercular bones. So, front limb, fishes and into tetrapods, the fishapod, Tiktaalik, and then tetrapods there. Yeah. There's just lots of little drawings here. That was when this was discovered, that guy who discovered it, the people who discovered it made the rounds on NPR, and they wrote a popular book here that you can find talking about it. And it's a big deal. Yeah, we got there. Okay, so. The early tetrapods, we go by all sorts of names. They're in the book. I'm not worried. We're not going to use them that often. They're called ichthyostagans, labyrinthodonts. These are these fishopods. These are these early tetrapods. They're in this transition zone here. And we have fossils associated with them. And we have tetrapod tracheids, which I think are really cool fossils. And this one in particular I like. There's his feet. And look, there's his belly. His belly dragged through the mud there as he walked. If this was on land, he's up on land, but he's not very good at it. He's kind of pulling himself along with his belly dragging. That's a little sign there. Labyrinthodonts, by the way, we know them mostly from their teeth. Their teeth have these wavy patterns in them like a labyrinth. That's a funny old-fashioned word for maze right there. So that's why they got that name, labyrinth tooth. So there we are in different reconstructions of them. Okay. As we move on up, here they are. Here, these are mostly fish, or mostly aquatic, I'm sorry. And as we move on up, we're done with them. We start to see things that we're now going to start classifying as more and more terrestrial. Terrestrial maybe the level a frog is, so that's pretty terrestrial. And we see all sorts of skeletal innovations show up there that point to that. And those guys are the guys that make this divergence, which we talked about on the board here a little while ago. We go heavily terrestrial towards the amniotes, and we kind of stick with the same plan and stay semi-terrestrial, and we end up with amphibians. Again, think frog or salamander. And there's that divergence there. Here's these guys. And as they go truly terrestrial, 2 branches. So again, this is our summary. Make those words your friends. Move your finger around this, and I think you're in good shape. So you understand that. Okay. Those 2 words, lepospondyle and tenospondyle. I told you I wasn't going to use them a whole lot, but I wanted to define them just so you know what we're talking about, and then we'll move on. The lepospondyls trend towards amniotes, more terrestrial. Temnospondyls go towards what we call amphibians today. And what those words refer to, there's the thing there, onto amniotes, onto amphibians. What those words refer to, spondyle, is spool or cylinder. And so this is talking about their vertebrae. And this is anatomy we don't have time for in a class like this, but it's kind of cool. If I had specimens, we could look at better specimens, we could look at some lab. There's an evolutionary tree. Up here, we're still aquatic. We're still those aquatic tetrapods there, prototetrapods. And here's that split right here. And so we've got the temnospondyls. We've got the leptospondylus. See these vertebrae? The differences aren't important to us, but look at the main thing here. As we go increasingly terrestrial, until we get to amniotes down here, the vertebrae become more solid, and whereas the primitive vertebrae is 2 or 3 pieces, all fused together in the amniote. It's about better weight bearing, better terrestrial living. So that's what those words mean. I'm not that concerned with the details there, like schizomerous and all that other stuff there. Rachytomus. That's for an anatomy class. But just to give you a peek there, leptospondylus vertebrae, that would be an amniote. The parts are fused together and they make a really solid framework. A temnospondylus condition is more fish-like, and that's something we'd see in amphibian or the amphibian ancestors. So just again, one example of many we can peek at and give us a clue as to what these creatures were doing. The anatomy is structured to a particular niche, to a particular biology, and we can get clues about that when we look at that. So on the amniote side of things, we'll come back to these next week, on the amniote side of things, we've got these cool things called lepospondylus and anthracosaurs. Lepospondylus and anthracosaurs. And these guys were really well positioned when the Permian hit. Remember, the Permian is drier and colder than what had come before. So the Permian really favored things that could handle cooler, drier conditions. And these guys were sitting there, and that was their time. And they diversified in the amniotes. Although the primitive ones, if we had one alive today and we studied its biology, all these early things are probably very amphibian-like in their biology. And I'm guessing almost all of them, if not all of them, had to walk back to water to lay eggs. Because fancy terrestrial eggs hadn't evolved yet. So that's why we often call them amphibians, but I'm going to put quotes around it. But they were big. They were 2 meters long, some of them. And they go on to the amniotes. And that's next. Sorry, next week. Did that. I'm trying to figure out where to put this. So I stuck it in right here. Maybe not the best position, but just a little sidetrack I want to take here. I don't know if you've noticed as I keep putting pictures of these things up, right? They look like lizards, don't they? They all look like lizards, and that's the basic tetrapod anatomy. You know, lizards come much later. Lizards have this basic tetrapod anatomy: 4 legs, long body, tail. That's the basic tetrapod form, which we call lizard-like, because that's what we have with us today. And we see that lizard-like anatomy all over the place in living things. We see it in lizards, the crocodilians. We see it in salamanders. Lizard-like. But the other way to think about that is it's not lizard-like. It's lizards, and these things, they basically have the basic tetrapod anatomy. Here's a bunch of fossil things showing it. Both amphibians with quotes around them, amniotes, and otherwise. That basic lizard-like anatomy is what the original tetrapod looked like. The original tetrapod was this particular anatomy, and so whenever we see it in living things or fossil things, what we're seeing is the basic tetrapod anatomy. We're seeing ancient evolution there, or an ancient evolutionary stage there. It's just a very efficient body construction, what first tetrapod innovated, and it still is maintained in lots of different groups. So I've talked about this before. Whenever you look at a group like tetrapods or chordates or vertebrates or whatever, the first one sets up the stage for everyone who comes later. And that basic 4-legged long tail anatomy was established very early on in tetrapod evolution, and it still is held onto by an awful lot of creatures. And we call it lizard-like, even though lizards are just a modern practitioners of it. Okay, I think that was. Let's look at the amphibians. Where am I here? There we go. I'm just going to focus on living stuff from here on out for amphibians. Well, we have to originate it. So here we are. We're done with amniotes for a while. We're over here. Ancient temnospondyle things up on land, diversifying, and one small group survives and becomes what we call amphibians. These guys diversified in the Devonian enormously, and there's a huge fossil diversity. Back there in the Devonian and the Carboniferous, when the Earth was covered with rainforests. And I got a picture, yeah, so that's back here. And that picture, here we go. There's a big fossil diversity of these guys. Proto-amphibians. We're not calling them amphibians yet, but we're calling them fossil temnospondylus. For 100 million years, this was their time in these rainforest-covered plant continents. Classic example of a big chunky one is Euryops, I think from Texas, late in the era of this group of creatures. It's a big lizard-like thing. But let's look at the living ones. Lysamphibian. Last time I'm going to use that word. Class Amphibia. Let's just call them amphibians from here on out. I bet some of you had a pet amphibian for a while, or at least picked one up when you're out hiking or camping. Frogs, salamanders, and a cool group called Sicilians, which you're probably not familiar with. So these guys have their roots in the Carboniferous. You got fossil things we would call amphibians going 300 million years back in these ancient rainforest-covered continents. Way back here. And then these are the survivors, and it's not a particularly big group. But they give us a peek at what it was like for an early tetrapod to be living on land. So they show kind of, when we look at them, we see kind of the primitive manifestation of terrestrial living for a tetrapod. So just a few ways amphibians do it, a few ways they address the challenges that a fish, for example, wouldn't deal with. Senses. We need terrestrial senses now. And remember, fish are hearing with their lateral line. That doesn't work on land. So we've concentrated the sense of hearing in the inner ear, and we transmit vibrations to the inner ear with an eardrum or tympanic membrane, which vibrates with the sound. And if you remember, we talked about this earlier, talking about hearing, but it's just worth reminding us. There's the inner ear, and primitively, in tetrapods, there's a bone. From the inside of the eardrum, the tympanum, the inner ear is a bone there. It's called the columella. How many inner ear bones do you have as a mammal? You have 3. The primitive tetrapod condition is 1. I can't remember which one this is in you, but you have this bone. It's just not called the columella in you. But that transmits the vibrations from the environment to the inner ear. And you can see them. We'll get some skeletons out. There's a frog skull right there. You can often see it. They're carefully prepared. That little bone is still there. One of the other senses is the olfactory senses, olfaction. We're now detecting chemicals suspended in air, not water, done with the same organ. The molecules are pulled in through the nostrils and they come up against the sensory epithelium and we smell. They're just smelling air, fish are smelling water. And the other thing we've talked about, probably beating this to death, is the ancestor of amphibians, that opening from the nasal cavity into the mouth was formed, the choanae. And we have joined breathing and smelling, which is a tetrapod thing, not a fish thing. Amphibians still breathe the primitive way. They breathe with what's called positive pressure breathing. They swallow air and force it into their lungs. That's the old-fashioned way to breathe and ventilate your lungs. Amniotes, you are a negative pressure breather. You expand your chest cavity and pull the air in. We know that's a better way because it's what we do. But they are breathing the old-fashioned way, called positive pressure breathing. A lot of amphibians breathe through their skin. A lot of fish do too. If you keep the skin damp and you pump blood through it, you can do gas exchange through your skin. And many amphibians, in fact, probably all amphibians, get a significant amount of their oxygen and gas exchange through their skin, lungs, but also using their skin. The circulatory system shows a primitive tetrapod, primitive terrestrial way of working. We look at the circulatory system. There's fishes. Remember fishes? We got a single pump, single circuit system. That's what fishes do. And there's the respiratory system, the gills there. When we transition to tetrapods, and amphibians show us the primitive tetrapod condition, we've got a two-circuit system, a body, that's called the systemic system, the body, and the lungs. And one pump, but two circuits. Not extremely efficient, but more efficient than a fish. So we have separate respiratory systemic circuits. And there they are side by side. Put your finger on there and see the difference there. How many pumps do you have in your heart?
4.
You have 4 chambers, you have 2 pumps, right? This is a 3-chambered heart, just a single pump. But that's an amniote solution. We're not there yet. And then amphibians have this side branch off their pulmonary trunk going to the skin. Sends blood to the lungs, also sends it to the skin. That's an amphibian thing. That doesn't work. Once you get your skin dry and scaly like an amniote, that's not going to work. Okay, we did that. Waste elimination is another thing we're not going to spend a lot of time on, at least in the anatomy of it, but tetrapod and aquatic waste elimination is very different. Fishes just eliminate their wastes into the water through their gills, at least a lot of them. That doesn't work when you're on land. You have to have other adaptations for waste elimination now. You have kidneys that dump urine into a kidney, into a bladder, things like that. And lots of modifications to the skeleton are evident for bearing weight, for moving around on land, and so we see skeletal and muscle innovations. Did that. All right. But amphibians are still very closely tied to water, as we assumed the early tetrapods were. They're nice analogs to what early tetrapod biology was like. Closely tied to water. Amphibians lay their eggs in water. There are none that there are a few freaks that do some really odd things, but generally amphibians have to lay their eggs in water. These are basically fish eggs, and they develop in water. Many amphibians breathe with gills, even as adults. All larvae do. But many amphibians are still breathing with gills because they're aquatic, or their larvae are aquatic. So we're up on land. We're just, not all our life stage, not all parts of our life stages are up on land. Okay. Well, we're done with all this stuff here. I blanked it out there. Go this way. We're way up here now. Right? There we go. 3 living orders. Remember our classification? Phylum, class, order. 3 living orders of amphibians. The first one is one that people are least familiar with because we don't have any in North America. And they're entirely tropical. And they go by the name Sicilian. That means that's from a Greek or Latin word meaning blind, because a lot of them don't have eyes. The order name is Gymnophiona, or an older order name is Apoda. What does Apoda mean? What's pod mean? Foot. And you put an A in front of it? No feet. Yeah, they don't have feet. They don't have legs. Gymnophiona means naked snake. They're snake-like, but they don't have scales. So these are Sicilians, and what they are is they're legless amphibians. Not very many of them. They're tropical. About 200 species are known. And this is their distribution. mostly rainforest. This is just a cool picture of one. They're highly adapted for worming and burrowing their way around, like a snake. It's a parallel adaptation to snakes losing their legs. I just found pictures because I like them, as most of you aren't familiar with them. Some of them practice parental care, where the mom cares for the babies. A lot of them have highly reduced eyes. They're adapted for burrowing into leaf litter and soft soils, looking for small invertebrates to eat. They're little carnivores. They're actually ferociously primitive, highly specialized into that burrowing niche. But as amphibians go, this is the bottom end of living amphibians. They're very, very primitive in many aspects of their biology, just super specialized. You used to see them at tropical fish stores, and I keep coming back to that. We don't have very many tropical fish stores like we did 30 years ago. You have PetSmart now, and nothing against PetSmart, but when you had locally owned tropical fish stores, you get all sorts of weird stuff because the owner would say, "Oh, I want some of that," and bring it in. And you used to see them at pet stores. There's an aquatic one from South America that's fully aquatic, never comes out of water, and they used to sell them as rubber eels. I haven't seen one in decades at a pet store, which is just as well. They should be leaving them in the wild. That's just a great picture. So Sicilians, highly specialized, legless burrower. I don't have any specimens to show you in lab. Next group you're familiar with, and maybe you've caught one. Or seen one when you're hiking. They're called Caudata, order Caudata, sometimes called the order Urodela. Urodela is an older name. Caudata, what's caudos mean, you know? Try again. Tail. Tailed amphibians. And these are the salamanders. Euro means tail too, Euro. So salamanders, that's not a huge group. 500 species are known. North America, the Northern Hemisphere is most of the diversity of the Northern Hemisphere. They haven't gone to Southeast Asia, none in Australia. I think very interesting, none in Africa, except some European ones that have crossed the Mediterranean. So it's probably in Northern Hemisphere then. Yeah.
Are giant salamanders part of this group?
Yeah.
So okay.
There we go. Yeah. Just because I like the extremes, there's this genus of giant salamanders, Adrius, and there's one in Japan, and these are really, really cool. And apparently someone told me who spent some time in Japan with the military, her husband, that there's a lot of folk tales involving these about eating children if they're bad and naughty and things like that. But they're kind of cool, and that doesn't tell you how big they are. Look at that thing. That's a big salamander. Japan is an island, and Japan has held on to some really cool wildlife. And there's one in China, too. I picked this picture because it gives you some scale. And look at that monster. Chinese, unfortunately, in their rapid desire to be economically advanced, are destroying their natural heritage pretty rapidly. I don't know if this thing is endangered or not. But these are the biggest ones. This is the smallest known salamander. It's from Alabama. That's a dime. That's an adult. Random salamander things. In North America, the diversity is highest in the southeast part of the United States, Appalachia and the southern states, where those wet, damp habitats are great for salamanders, and it's quite a neat diversity down there. People down there discovering new species all the time, regularly. That's out all the time. Common family in North America is the Plethodontidae. We'll come back to them, but if you've caught a salamander, often it very likely was a plethodontid salamander. I found pictures of the mating. It's not particularly intimate. A pair get together and they decide to mate, and then the male lays a little package of sperm on the ground called a spermatophore, and the female squats over it and pushes it up into her genital pore, and then the eggs are fertilized. The larvae are aquatic in all cases. In many cases, they're gill breathing. They have external gills hanging off their side of their head, and they breathe with gills. When I was a kid, you used to see these red newts in pet shops. I haven't seen one of those. Anyone seen one of those since you guys were alive? They used to be another common pet shop thing. There's some salamander eggs, and I put this in there again to remind myself that these are fish eggs. These are hardly different than a fish would lay. And they have to be laid in water. Just a tiny salamander larva. They swim around in water and they breathe with these external gills, which when they crawl up on land, these gills disappear and they start breathing with their lungs. Question?
Are axolotls part of this?
Yes, axolotls. Axolotls, yeah, I should put that in. Axolotls, we'll get to that. Actually, I have a slide for that, yeah. There's a few weirdos out there. Here's a salamander that burrows. This one's from Alabama. Burrows under a log, and she lays her eggs in bags of mucus and keeps them damp while they develop. But that's just a weird specialization. This is an axolotl. Remember we talked about pediamorphosis, juvenile things becoming sexually mature, and neoteny, which is another way of saying the same thing. There are some salamanders that do that. This thing from Mexico called axolotl is one. It never transitions into adult anatomy, and it spends its whole life with gills, living in water, but that's a sexually mature animal. So that's an example of pediamorphosis, again, an adult biology in a larval body. Random North American ones, good for you to make a point. This one's called Amphiuma, and look at the tiny legs on that thing. This is an aquatic thing, and legs just get in the way. It's an aquatic carnivore. Midwest, southeast United States, you'd see these in streams there, and the legs are highly reduced. In some cases, the legs are almost just little stumps with not even fingers on them. But that's a snake niche, again, burrowing around, worming around, looking for food. There's this cute little leg. And look at all these sensory pits on his face. Very fish-like. This thing never leaves the water. We used to see these when we were collecting fish in the Midwest. We used to turn these up. This is the larva amida. Another one's called siren that you see in the Midwest. The genus is siren. It has no legs, and it's fully aquatic. I'm sorry, this is the one that has little front legs. It has no hind legs. I'm getting ahead of myself. So the point of putting these things in is leg reduction is a thing. We're going to encounter this again and again, but we lost our legs in Sicilians and Amphiuma and sirens show leg reduction. Legs just get in the way in certain niches and they disappear. They disappear in snakes too, right? Same thing. I was bitten by one of these once. That's why I put it in there. Cryptobranchus is called a hellbender. They're big Midwestern, Southeastern salamander, big North American one. And we used to occasionally get them on our nets when we were searching for fish. Cryptobranchus means hidden gills. I'm not sure what that's trying to describe. That young woman out there doing field work with
Flip-flops.
flip-flops and toenail polish. One interesting specialization in the family of salamanders is that Plethodontid family. They have no lungs. The lungs never develop, and they do all their respiration through their skin. Imagine they dry out just a little bit, they die. That's their respiratory surface. You can get away with that if you're not very big. Okay, got a few more things here, and then we'll call it a day, take a little break, and move on. A neura means no tail. Ura means tail. Put an A in front of it, you get no tail, and that's the frogs and the toads. Frogs and toads, this is the most successful of the living amphibian groups. We're pushing 5,000 species here, and they're pretty much found everywhere the habitat's appropriate. It gets super cold up here, you don't have them in high latitudes, you don't have them in ferocious deserts. But other than that, frogs and toads everywhere. Yeah. The earliest frogs are Triassic. And this is an obvious question, but it's worth asking. The niche they moved into was a really successful one. And what do they do that other amphibians don't do? Jump. Yeah. Their whole biology, their whole anatomy and body gets jerked around by these big hind legs for jumping. And that was obviously the way to go because this is the group that's most successful today. My daughter learned to read with frog and toad. I don't know if any of you did.
Oh, yeah.
Shoot. So just some frog diversity. Leopard frogs are in the genus Rana. These are the green spotty frogs you frequently see. The common North American genus is Rana. There's many, many species of them. We call them leopard frogs, some we call them green frogs. And Hyla is the tree frog genus, and usually much smaller, with little suction cups on the end of their feet. Then they climb in trees or on rocks or in sides of buildings. Toads are in the genus Bufo. Not all toads, but things we typically call toads are in the genus Bufo. And toads are frogs. Toads are types of frogs. They're just frogs that are a little bit more terrestrial. Their skin is a little bit drier, a little bit thicker, so they are a little more resistant to drying out. And you'll find them, as adults at least, a little bit further away from water than you'd find a frog. They're just a little bit more terrestrial. They still have to hop back to a stream or a pond to lay their eggs. There's the biggest aneurin that made it into modern times. It's African. Looked for a picture that wasn't a dead one being strung up by somebody. Little African boy holding a dead one, but at least not holding it by a hook. That's a big frog. And this is the smallest frog that is known present from Borneo in the rainforest, and that's a dime. This thing lays its eggs. Can you picture plants, that carnivorous plant with looks like a pitcher with water in it? They lay their eggs in the water in pitcher plants, and the tadpoles grow up in pitcher plants. I think that's really cool. Random bits of aneurin biology. This applies to some others as well, but frogs and toads tend to hibernate by burrowing. In much of North America, they bury themselves through the winter at the bottom of a pond or in a field, and they dig down there. Their metabolism slows to almost nothing, and they wait for the thaw. In our habitats, our frogs do this in the summer and wait for the rains to come in the winter. We do have amphibian habitat on campus. We didn't get much this year, but these are a couple pictures I've taken on campus. When it rains heavily, out past the housing, there's a couple places where water accumulates. And if it's there for more than a couple weeks, we will get frogs in it and we'll get tadpoles in it. Didn't this year. And even very, very temporary little things like this drainage ditch here. Well, my daughter and I have pulled tadpoles out of that on occasion. It's always nice if one of these sprinklers is broken and leaking just a little bit, because it'll maintain that pond there. Frogs talk to each other. These males talk to each other with what are called calls. Their mating calls are territorial calls. And they can be studied, and these are a graphic representation of frog calls. That's a CD, frog calls of the Rocky Mountains. A good amphibian biologist can identify these just like a good bird person can identify different bird calls. They're that distinctive, and I think, let's see if this will work.
It's muted.
Let's see, I was muted here too. And it's muted here. No? There it goes. Finally. And if you're on campus in a normal year, much wetter year than today, and you stand out in front of the science building in February, you can hear our native tree frogs talking to each other. There's a wetland back there by the power plant, and in the wetter year we had this year, you have them. Frog mating is called amplexus, and what they do is female, when she's ready, wanders into where the males are, and she just gets mobbed, and the biggest, coolest male grabs her, and if there's a smaller male on her back, he'll pull him off, and she exudes eggs at stimuli, and he sprays sperm on them, and then there they are. And there's no parental care beyond that. Yeah.
So I have 2 African dwarf frogs that stay only in the water.
Yeah.
How many species of frogs are like that are just for?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. There are some fully aquatic frogs, and that's one I don't know that. Yeah, that's Xenopus. I'll show you them in a minute. Yeah. And there's frog eggs, and again, they're very much like fish eggs. A couple more things I know. we're getting nervous, but I got a couple more things and then we'll take a break and then we'll do our exam. Frog eggs hatch into tadpoles. There are no exceptions. All frogs and toads start life with this aquatic larva, which is a tadpole, breathes with gills and through its skin. There's a few freaks out there. There's one frog carries her tadpoles around on her back and dips them into pools of water in trees where water collects. There was one frog where the eggs end, I don't know how they end up in little pockets on the mom's back. I can't remember how that happens. There was a frog in Australia and it went extinct last 20 years. We didn't take good care of it, but the female swallowed the eggs.
Yeah.
And the tadpoles developed in her stomach. And we lost that because we suck. The tadpoles are aquatic algae feeders. All frogs as adults, and when I say frog I mean toad too, are little carnivores. They're eating insects mostly. Actually, big frogs eat mice. But the larvae have little scraping pads on their mouth, and they have a completely different feeding niche. They scrape algae off of rocks and plants. And they make this cool metamorphosis. They change from a algae-feeding, gill-breathing swimmer to a carnivorous, hopping around terrestrial animal. And so there's the life cycle, and I imagine you're familiar with that. Maybe you've seen it in a class somewhere along the way. It's just kind of neat to get tadpoles and watch this happen. And there's those two niches. The larval form and the adult form, completely different niches. Different habitat niche, different food niche, different habitat niche, different food niche. In the same life cycle. Frog habitat. Just a couple more random things, some diversity. The big North American common frog is called a bullfrog, Rana tisbiana. It's bigger than most frogs in North America, at least. And this is its range. Historically, it was a Mississippi River thing, kind of east of the Rockies. And humans have moved them around. It's now very, very common in most California habitats all throughout here. Where this thing shows up, native frogs disappear. They get outcompeted by this thing. They get eaten by this thing. And so it becomes a real conservation problem wherever they show up. Which is too bad. I tried frog legs once, and I didn't enjoy them enough ever to think about trying them again. Arizona is an arid state, and Arizona has a number of species of native frogs, and all these are now endangered, and they're endangered for several reasons, but one of the reasons is the habitats they lived in now have bullfrogs in them. And so they are outcompeted and eaten into endangerment. This is a frog that was introduced to Australia, a toad actually, to eat agricultural pests, and it was introduced to Australia from the Caribbean, and it eats everything. And you might hear about the cane toad. It eats native mammals, it eats native amphibians, it eats native reptiles. It's an extremely destructive animal, and they're trying really hard to control it, but introduced species, once it's there, it's very hard to undo the damage. There's a big education program in Australia on cane toad busting. And someone asked about the little clawed frogs from Africa. The genus is Xenopus. They're fully aquatic, and you see them in pet shops, little small ones. This animal was brought into captivity, and it's almost like a lab rat. If you're doing studies and you need an amphibian model, this is it, kind of like the white mouse or the lab rat. It's very widely used in science labs. And it's African by native habitat, although we now have them in Southern California and around Tucson, there's a population. So don't let your frogs go. We don't want them here. Oh, they're already here. So from a conservation perspective, they face the same conservation problems almost any group does, but there's a new one, and it's called chytridomycosis. It's a fungal infection, and it kills amphibians. And it's killing amphibians worldwide for about 20, 30 years now. We don't know why. It's been around forever, but starting 20, 30 years ago, it started to kill amphibians very aggressively, and so we're having a lot of amphibian populations disappear worldwide. Possibly related to climate change or related to thinning of the ozone layer. That's one thing there, but certainly human associated. This is just a diversity by color. The darker the red, the more amphibian species, and you can see southeastern United States is just amphibian heaven. Locally, this is not great amphibian habitat, Southern California. We have a few on campus. This is one, most common one I hear or see. They're about this big as adults, and where those puddles or ponds form on campus, if they're there for more than a few weeks in the spring, we'll get these little tree frogs in them, and they'll lay eggs, and we'll get tadpoles. We've got a salamander that I've only seen once, very thin little salamander. He spends all his life burrowing in the ground, so you wouldn't catch them normally. And we've got a toad that I see occasionally, but not very often. Last time we were down the stream last spring, the toads had just metamorphosed into adults from tadpoles, and the banks of the stream had thousands of toadlings. They're all about this big, they're like grasshoppers in the grass moving in some manner. And just one more point on Southern California frog. This is our leopard frog, our Southern California leopard frog, Rhona draytoni. It's an endangered species. And this is a newspaper article from last year. Eggs of threatened frogs, Southern California. This is down the Santa Monica Mountains, down not all that far from Thousand Oaks. They found a small population of these guys, of a very rare frog, and there's the eggs they found, and they were so excited. Actually, the article says hopping for joy. The scientists were hopping for joy, which is just a pun. But that's kind of cool. When we care for things, we can bring them back. And that, I don't know if anyone, I can't think of anyone on this campus has worked on that. That would be another potentially really good project for an ESRM major or a biology major to do work on that. But part of our natural heritage. Anyway, yeah, I lingered on a little longer than I needed it to. Any questions? Okay. Let's take about 20 minutes, half an hour. I'll be back here about 20 minutes, half an hour at the exam. And you can start. Okay, so you need a Scantron sheet. I've got a few, but Scantron sheet and a pencil. And just relax for a few minutes and we'll start.